Okay, so we'll go back to the meaning of spiritual community. So this is, again, it's a talk Sangharakshita gave back in the 1970s in New Zealand, when it was the birth of Triratna in New Zealand as a spiritual community. I don't know how many of you have listened to Sangharakshita's talks. I know personally, I find there was kind of a particular style to them. You know, he's very precise and he's very clear in defining terms. It's almost as if kind of entertainment is not the purpose of the talk. The purpose of the talk is to give you the tools to transform your life. Yeah. So if you kind of put in a Sangharakshita talk thinking you're going to get a bit of a kind of a jazzy talk, you might be disappointed. If you're looking for entertainment, if you're looking for the tools to transform your life, then he gets right at that. And it's almost he's giving very clear guidance on what to do, and he's kind of offering you that as a gift, and you then decide whether you want to accept that or not. So in the talk, he breaks it down into these three questions: who are the members of the spiritual community? Where is the spiritual community? And what do the members of the spiritual community do? So despite having those three questions, that's probably the last 15, 20 minutes of the talk. Because in kind of true Sangharakshita style, he starts off by defining his terms. So he starts off by defining this term spiritual, as this group over here mentioned. I guess in the 70s, the term spiritual was used in many different contexts, man, and everybody was spiritual man. So, he kind of said it's rather loosely defined and used. So obviously there's a concern that in that cultural climate, the word spiritual is being misused. Maybe today it's used far less, and maybe we need to use it more often. But certainly perhaps in the 70s, it was used very loosely. And so he spent quite a lot of time defining spiritual. So he says it's not a psychological or worldly term. It's not simply about the mind or mental states. So in Buddhism, spiritual, according to Sangharakshita, refers specifically to skillful mental states. When you talk about spiritual, he's talking about the cultivation of skillful mental states. And in typical Sangharakshita style, he says, what does the word skillful mean? So he says, this is one of the most important words in Buddhism. So the Pali is kusala, and the opposite, unskillful, is akusala. So he's very clear that this one word is critical in terms of how we practice the Dharma, how we become spiritual. So he says unskillful means mental states associated with craving, aversion, and delusion. The three poisons: craving, aversion, and delusion. And skillful mental states are those associated with contentment, friendliness, and wisdom. You might add metta and love it onto that list. Now, the opposites of craving. And I don't think it's a list of do's and don'ts. It's kind of a list we have to work out for ourselves. What is skillful? What is unskillful? What leads to craving, aversion, delusion? What leads to contentment, friendliness, and wisdom? So they're not opposites in the terms of good and evil, which we might come across in Western culture a lot. They're really kind of guiding posts to give us some sort of directionality in the way we want to live our lives, give us choices. And he says that these terms kind of suggest a number of things. So he talks about the holy fool, the person who's wise and knows everything, has good intentions, but doesn't put it into practice. So he says in Buddhism, there's no such thing as a holy fool. You can't know the Dharma and have all the intentions to be skillful and be kind and calm and friendly, but don't do it. So to be skillful means to be skillful with body, speech, and mind, all three, as far as possible. And the alternative, the flip side, to be unskillful, comes with consequences. So if you act unskillfully, there are consequences to that in terms of how our mind cultivates itself, how our relationships with people develop. So they both have consequences, whether we act skillfully or unskillfully. So again, Sangharakshita is saying we have to take responsibility for ourselves. We have to take responsibility for the choices that we make if we wish to live spiritually. So to live spiritually is to deliberately and intentionally make choices to live skillfully in ways which will cultivate love, friendliness, kindness, contentment. He also talks a little about some Tibetan translations of these words. So he talks about craving as being a longing desire to possess objects of sensuous cognition, things which kind of enhance your ego identity, your sense of self-importance, things you want to be a part of you. I notice for me, that's often if I'm listening to music or I'm listening to the T20 semi-final cricket, which was on this evening. I don't just listen to it. I want to be the person who's getting the wickets or scoring the runs or playing the music. I kind of want to kind of get some sort of fame out of it. Particularly, I want to feed my ego rather than just enjoy the music performance or the cricket for what it is. And also, kind of even have sense of respect, empathy, joy for the people performing it. There's a sense of wanting to accumulate my own ego around it. So that's the craving part. The aversion bit is obviously fearful or angered repulsion towards objects of sensuous cognition, things that you want to exclude from your ego identity, things you don't want to have a part of you. So I was just coming back on a flight yesterday with quite a few people not wearing masks, which I found a little bit uncomfortable, which I didn't see the cabin crews do much about. And I definitely didn't want to have a part of that. And there was definitely a sense of having to make a choice as to how I dealt with it. Kind of, do I want to say something to the cabin staff or move seats, or can I be okay with it? But there's definitely a sense of not wanting them to be part of my experience and having to make a choice about how I dealt with that. Then really undercutting all those is delusion, which is that kind of sense of stubborn, closed-mindedness about learning anything which you feel might threaten your ego identity. So these young men on the plane have no idea what their backstory was, why they weren't wearing masks, why they were being a bit kind of laddish in their attitude towards the cabin staff, or maybe they're full of fear about the whole thing, and this is their way of dealing with it. I don't know, but there's a bit of a kind of a slight unwillingness not to kind of see it from their perspective. There's definitely a kind of a sense of I had an ego view of the situation, and I kind of navigating it, but I didn't really go beyond it. So what Sangharakshita says then, so a spiritual community is a community which encourages the development of skillful mental states rather than unskillful mental states. It's a community which sees the development of skillful mental states as being the best ideal for being a human being. So it's the best way to live a human life to its full potential. So a spiritual life, a member of the spiritual community, is a life devoted to the elimination of unskillful mental states and the cultivation of skillful mental states. So a spiritual practice is any method conducive to developing skillful mental states and eradicating unskillful mental states. So Sangharakshita is really, 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 really clear about what he means by spiritual. It's the practice of removing unskillful mental states and cultivating skillful mental states. And he's basically saying, over to you. You are responsible for that. It's your choice. And he's offering you this teaching. he goes a little bit deeper, and he kind of starts to draw out, I think, a little bit, like distinguishing between how you might progress from somebody who's maybe just coming in contact with Buddhism, just coming into terms of looking at their mental states. So he talks about, people existing on the worldly plane, people who are entirely motivated by unskillful mental states. Perhaps not even aware of their mental states, we might even say. They just live life as they see it, not really aware of what's going on, just relating to the world in terms of what they want and what they can pull towards them, and pushing away the things they dislike. Then there's kind of this kind of mixed plane, which certainly I'll put myself in, this kind of sense of trying to live a spiritual life, sometimes worldly and sometimes spiritual, sometimes kind of reactive towards situations and sometimes more creative. But in a way, what we're trying to do as a practitioner of spiritual community is move towards the spiritual plane, a plane in which we're motivated entirely by spiritual states: contentment, love, wisdom, mindfulness, energy, faith, joy, compassion. So what Sangharakshita actually says is the spiritual plane is the plane on which people are motivated entirely or almost entirely by skillful mental states, motivated by contentment, love, knowledge, motivated by mindfulness, energy, faith, joy, compassion. It's a plane in which they perform actions which are helpful, generous, and pure, where they speak words that are true, that are affectionate, that promote concord and harmony, and conduce to the good of the hearer. There's some beautiful words: energy, faith, love, compassion, joy. So he's also saying that to live a skillful life also is a life which is full of joy, love, compassion, energy, mindfulness, really kind of positive qualities. But it's quite a high bar as well. It says you want to live a spiritual life, you've really got to commit fully, wholly, and completely to achieve it. It's not something you can kind of do at a weekend. It's something you need to integrate into all elements and all levels of your life. Or at least that's the direction of travel you are aiming to move towards. He does briefly also explore this in terms of meditation. And I just quote him again, that meditation is best seen as being an uninterrupted flow of skillful mental states without the unskillful intruding. This is what meditation essentially is. And this is quite a useful way of looking at it, since it makes clear that meditation does not necessarily mean sitting in meditation. Meditation essentially is simply this flow of spiritual thoughts, whether we are sitting, walking, standing, or doing anything else. So maybe we can get a little bit of a mistake that when we talk about a Buddhist practice, we often talk about our meditation practice. And how's your meditation practice going? Are you sitting regularly? How long are you sitting for? What mental states are arising? All very useful conversations. But the spiritual life is 24/7. It's everything that we're trying to do throughout the day. What's our mental states like the whole time? So Akash Raj and I were having a very brief chat over the tea break, and we were sharing a little bit of kind of practice, which for me is like, when I'm in situations like, I was on a bus the other day and there's people smoking in the back of it. What do you do with that? Do you contract around that sense of, why are they doing that? They shouldn't be doing that. That's not right. Or can you kind of sit with that with a sense of spaciousness? Can you bring the kind of qualities of energy, faith, joy, compassion, the qualities of space to that, and respond out of a skillful means rather than unskillful? Do you need to respond at all? Can you just let it go and it'll pass? So there's a kind of, one of my practices, which I think is meditation, it's kind of to sit in a sense of space when doing things. I try this when listening to the cricket. Rather than contracting around, it's me hitting sixes for England, just enjoy the commentary and enjoy the performance that's going on, and don't try and the word own that for yourself. Don't kind of appropriate it into your ego, giving it more space. So in a way, anytime you're living in a skillful mental state, in a way you are, in a way meditating, you're bringing mindfulness to your life. And just to be absolutely clear, Sangharakshita says that skillful mental states include their physical and verbal elements. So when we say skillful mental states, we mean of body, speech, and mind. So again, it's not just enough to kind of mentally give something up or mentally make a commitment to do something. You literally have to put that into practice, or literally give up your craving, your greed, your delusion. And of course, we have a literal example of that, which is the Buddha. The Buddha's going forth was a giving up of his old life to move away from greed, hatred, and delusion, to live skillfully. So to live a spiritual life is to go forth into abandoning our unskillful mental states, to live out of skillful mental states, love, friendliness, contentedness. And then what? We go forth. What happens? Maybe nothing. Maybe that's it. You just go forth on your own, trying to practice skillful mental states, cultivate them day by day. And if you come to the Triratna ordination ceremony, there's two parts to it, as I recall. The first part is a commitment to practice the Dharma, practice the spiritual life, whatever happens. Regardless of what happens, you won't give up. You will keep going. The other side of it is that you might also find there's a spiritual community of other men, women, non-gendered people who also want to practice, who also have the same ideal. And that then is a spiritual community. Now, on the day of the Buddha, there was no spiritual community. He had to found the spiritual community, he had to found the Sangha. Luckily, within Triratna and with other Buddhist groups, we have a spiritual community. So Sangharakshita asked the question, so what is it that we actually come into contact with when we come into contact with the spiritual community? So I think it's partly, as Vajrapriya says, what we come into contact with is not a group, it's not an association, it's not a club, it's not a team. It's a community of individuals who have gone for refuge. It's a community of individuals who have committed themselves to the three jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And I think this is a particular emphasis that Sangharakshita placed upon the spiritual community when he founded the order. So I'll quote him. The spiritual community are individuals who have accepted responsibility for their own lives. So first you accept responsibility for your own life. And they've decided that they want to develop as human beings and they want to grow. The spiritual, the ordinary sense. It is not something collective with a collective mind or soul. It has no collective identity in which you lose your own or in which you become submerged. The spiritual community is a voluntary association of three individuals who have come together on account of a common commitment to a common ideal, a commitment to what we call the three jewels. It's quite a difficult question to explain to people what the order is sometimes. Because what is the order? It's not, there is no order in the sense of there being something. It's just a free collection of individuals. But there's a Buddhist center and there's a Triratna order office and there's all these kind of institutions that seem to be here. But in a way, they're only institutions or bodies which support the order, but the order in itself only exists in as such as there's a free association of individuals. There's no club you can join, no society, no membership card. Though I think you can get a little identification card if you need to travel overseas for particular purposes, but it doesn't entitle you to any membership privileges of any way, shape, or form. So in a way, the spiritual community is purely association freely entered into of people with the same spiritual vision, people who are practicing the cultivation of skillful mental states. And Sangharakshita also says it's a practicing and development of skillful mental states for the purpose of gaining enlightenment. So it's not for the purpose of getting slightly more relaxed, slightly more mindful, less stressed, less agitated, a bit more blissed out. All these things are useful benefits along the journey, but there's a very clear goal, which is enlightenment, liberation, transcendence, whatever word works for you. So there's a very clear goal behind spiritual community. And he also said they have absolute commitment. So I do recommend reading his talks because they're really actually quite useful to reflect on, do I have absolute commitment? Oh, interesting. Sangharakshita says in concrete terms, a spiritual community is those who have been ordained and committed themselves to the three jewels. That might perhaps be rather a strict definition. I think people have said, a spiritual community can be anybody or any community of people who freely associate around a particular set of values. I guess within Triratna, ordination signifies a certain change in your level of commitment, a kind of a more absolute commitment to this path. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you're not ordained, you can't have the same level of commitment. We'll come on to why becoming an order member might be helpful and useful, but there's not a kind of you're in or you're out. Those who are ordained are more committed than those who are not. The Sangharakshita is very clear. Again, this is, I think it's quite unique to Triratna, is that it's a commitment to the three jewels that makes you a part of the spiritual community, a member of it. It's not your lifestyle, whether you're ordained, whether you're monastic, whether you live in a monastery, whether you wear robes, all those are secondary. So who are the members of the spiritual community? Are those who are committed to cultivating skillful mental states. Where is the spiritual community found? Wherever those people gather, be it in a field, a bus, a Buddhist center. Personally, when I was reading these texts on different flights and buses over the last couple of weeks, I felt part of a spiritual community there because it connected me into the people who also followed the teaching of Sangharakshita, the people who were also inspired by him to practice their lives and place their trust in those teachings. So to me, there's a sense of the spiritual community was found where I can connect into that sense of practice, that sense of togetherness, that sense of purpose that inspires and kind of takes us beyond our ordinary, mundane ways of living to kind of relate on a higher spiritual level. Which was a bit of a lesson for me to kind of make sure that I often travel and I'm away for extended periods, but I can still be in contact with the spiritual community. I think in fact, actually Sangharakshita talked about never being separated from his teachers. He always felt his teachers were present, even if he didn't see them or meet them or talk to them. So to be clear, the spiritual community is not limited to monastic settings. This is a great mistake, to quote Sangharakshita. Not that monasteries are bad, but it's not the only way to practice. And you'll see within Triratna, clearly, we're not a monastic order. So his final question was, what do members of the spiritual community do? What do they do for themselves? Not in a selfish way. They carry out their individual practice. They meditate, study, practice right livelihood, live in a way which is consistent with cultivating skillful mental states and eradicating unskillful mental states. A bit of a theme developing. But more importantly than that, and this was kind of interesting and a little bit new for me, each member puts themselves in a position through which they can relate to each other on a purely spiritual basis. Where we're trying to relate to each other through a common spiritual ideal, a common spiritual commitment to practice. So it means relating to one another beyond our kind of mundane worldly concerns, the kind of transactional relationships we might find in everyday life, in terms of what I get out of the relationship or what I can get from, what I need to give to, who's a senior, who's a junior, all that kind of mundane way that society says we should relate to each other. It's trying to go way beyond that, to not kind of rationalize how we fit in, but relate to each other on purely spiritual terms, that spiritual ideal. And the way we do that, because if we can relate to each other on that terms of that spiritual ideal, we can relate to each other at our best. We can see each other at our best. And in that way, we can be fully ourselves. We can try and be wholly perfect in the sense of our practice, because we're amongst individuals who are also practicing the same ideals. If you try living out your spiritual ideals whilst you're working in an office where nobody else has the same shared ideals, it's tough. So one thing the spiritual community does for each other, it supports each other in living out these spiritual ideals, in relating to each other through that highest level of commitment, of ideals, of practice. So much of our lives requires us to relate in very different ways, the way in which are not aligned with our ideals. So in a way, what we do for ourselves as a spiritual community is give ourselves the opportunity to relate at our very best. So in a sense, in the spiritual community, there's no need for psychological defenses, no need to pretend, no need to relate to people based on how society says we should. It allows us to make spiritual progress more rapidly than would otherwise be possible. Imagine practicing without the support of the spiritual community, without the support of friends, teachers, people to confess, to forgive, to support. So in that sense, a spiritual community is there to support each other. Spiritually, practical matters, help people move chairs, pack up after the concert, where it was at the Abbey, which I wasn't there, apologies. So it kind of supports each other in all ways. And in a way, what we're doing in that, we're learning to relate to each other, which is not easy. The spiritual community has people from all sorts of different backgrounds, people who vote Conservative, people who vote Labour, people who vote probably right-wing parties, people who believe in climate change, people who don't. There's a whole wide mix of people in the spiritual community. People who will get on our nerves and be a little bit irritating, people that won't keep to time. But what we're doing in the way we relate, we're helping one another to overcome our purely subjective, purely personal limitations and learn to relate to each other on what is higher, what is the highest ideals. So in a way, we're supporting each other to go beyond our limiting sense of self. Almost by living out to the best we possibly can, we're lifting everybody else up. We're giving everybody else a taste of those ideals. So in a way, what we're doing, we are taking responsibility to create the conditions through which we can live out our lives and practice the spiritual ideals that we hold dear. What does spiritual community do for the world? Not a lot, in a sense. The Sangharakshita says, in a way, the spiritual community doesn't have to do anything for the world. Doesn't have any, doesn't have to justify itself within the world. The spiritual community in itself is enough. The fact that there's a community of people practicing in this way is a gift to the world. It is an offering. It is an opportunity to the world. It does make 2 points, however. The one is that the community maintains itself. It becomes a strong community of individuals practicing together. It offers that to other people in the world. It builds bridges between the world, or the worldly plane, and the spiritual plane. It offers Dharma classes, meditation courses, it offers Buddhist centers, it offers retreats, it offers opportunities for people to come from the worldly to the spiritual through that kind of mixed plane of confusion and hope and progress and all those things. And it does this in a way which is open and inclusive to everybody without any prejudice or any way. What Sangharakshita says in conclusion to his talk is, in this way, members of the spiritual community, or those individuals who are committed to the ideal of human enlightenment, committed to the attainment of higher levels of consciousness and insight, help promote in the world to develop more and more skillful thoughts, to grow in contentment, in love, and in understanding, and to know indeed for themselves the meaning of the spiritual community. So, in summary, the spiritual community is anywhere where you can orientate your life strongly and positively in the direction of the 3 jewels. Anywhere where you can take responsibility to transform your life through acting skillfully and abandoning unskillful actions. And if you're fortunate enough to meet others with the same ideal, to share that journey, then you will have the challenge and support and the context to develop your spiritual life. So in a sense, that's what we're trying to do here. That's what this, well, the centre just the bricks and mortar. The Sangha is an opportunity to develop ourselves, to live out the spiritual ideal, to orientate ourselves around the 3 jewels, to support each other in that quest for enlightenment, and to take responsibility for that. Nobody else is going to do it for us. Only we can create those conditions to create the spiritual community. So it's up to us. So 3 takeaways, if you want pithy little things to remember to take away. That's what I've taken from the talk. Firstly, act skillfully, abandon unskillful mental states. If you just focus on that for the next 30, 40, 50 years, then the lifetime after that, and the next one, and a few more maybe. Just do that. Everything else will look after itself. You don't need to read esoteric texts and lots of books, or read sufficient that will hone that ability to act skillfully. That's all you need to do. I say all. Secondly, put yourself in supportive conditions. Develop friendships with other members of the spiritual community. Come to Sangha night, come to Sangha day, come to the full moon puja, which may or may not be taking place. Come on retreat, meet friends for coffee. Surround yourselves as far as you can by those people who share your ideals. And be friendly and kind and compassionate to those who don't. That's also developing those ideals. And thirdly, take responsibility. Take responsibility for yourself and others. So act skillfully, put yourself in good conditions, and take responsibility. And if we all commit to do those 3 things, then we will have a spiritual community in Shrewsbury that will flourish. And that's it.